Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Back in early 1860, the United States was breaking apart literally at the seams. Years of discord over slavery had divided the country into two political tribes, and Congress battling for supremacy. As senators and Republicans dug their heels in, the country watched, seemingly powerless and helpless, as pro and anti slavery forces threatened, cajoled, maimed, and killed each other to bring Kansas into the Union on one side or the other. Meanwhile, the Supreme Court put its foot firmly in the pro slavery camp with the Dred Scott decision. Then, in Virginia, John Brown took matters into his own hands when he attempted to lead an insurrection by enslaved people against their enslavers. All this happening in the years leading up to the spring of 1860. Such was the state of the Union when, in Washington, D.C., on March 7th, 1860, the man pictured here, Representative Charles H. Van Wyck, a Republican from Orange County, New York, delivered a scathing anti slavery speech on the floor of the U.S. House of Representatives inside the U.S. Capitol building with its now famous dome under construction. I want to tell you what he said, opening remarks of the speech. Van Wyck began, Mr. Chairman, for many weeks, I was a patient listener to eloquent speeches from the leaders of the so-called Democratic Party on the floor of this House. Why do they charge the Republicans as agitators when they themselves have been sounding the notes of disunion and preaching violence for the only purpose of alarming the timidity of one and the weakness of another section of a common country, of arraying faction against faction first, to steel the heart against all sentiments of humanity, and then nerve the arm to execute its unholy impulses, charging treason upon the North and counseling the South to rebellion and resistance. Van Wyck continued, speaking directly to the evils of slavery. I believe slavery to be a crime against the laws of God and nature, violative of the instincts of a common humanity, that it degrades the African, paralyzes the energies of the Anglo Saxon, prevents the full development of the resources of the country, and granting to the masses of the people but little of material property and happiness. You talk of God, justice, and mercy, who hold, claiming by divine authority, 4 million human beings in hopeless and irretrievable bondage, and ostracize free white men who will not sing hosannas to your traffic in the bodies and souls of men, and stigmatize as murderers and felons those who will not applaud the cruelty which tramples upon all the attributes of the mind, the affections of the heart given by the Almighty to the children of his own creation. Van Wyck continued to speak for some time, bringing up various recent events, including the John Brown raid mentioned earlier. He also addressed one of the Southern members, one of those Democrats who had made a comment about New Englanders in colonial times burning witches. Van Wyck called out the representative. One gentleman spoke of Massachusetts burning witches in the ancient times. Does he not know that your own people burned slaves at the stake? And it seems to awaken no horror in your minds? At this, the Mississippi representative, Reuben Davis, interrupted. I pronounce the gentleman a liar and a scoundrel. I pronounce the gentleman's assertion false, utterly false. Van Wyck replied, my time is short, and I hope not to be interrupted. Representative Davis responded, you have no right to utter such foul and false slanders. Now, another representative stepped in, a Georgian, Lucius C. Gartrell. He rose with a point of order. It is that no member upon this floor has a right to libel the people of any section of this country and then deny to the representatives of that people the right to reply. I pronounce the assertion made by the gentleman false and unfounded. Then the Republicans, the entire side of the House, started crying, "Order, order." Calming down, Van Wyck now spoke again. "I have heard such words before, and I am not to be disturbed or interfered with by any blustering of that sort. I am here to libel any part of the Union. I am not here to libel any part of the Union." Now Davis, the Mississippian, challenged Van Wyck. "Will you go outside of the District of Columbia and test the question of personal courage with any Southern man?" Van Wyck stood his ground. "I travel anywhere and without fear of any one. For the first 8 weeks of this session, you stood upon the floor, continually libeling the North and the people of the free states, charging them with treason and all manner of crimes, and now you are thrown into great rage when I tell you a few facts." And so it continued on and on and on. Van Wyck, in fact, did not need to leave the District of Columbia to test the question of his courage. Less than a year later, on Washington's birthday, February 22nd, 1861, 3 assassins attacked Van Wyck as he walked on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. Here's a report of what happened from a newspaper, the Buffalo Daily Republic. It's datelined Washington, February 22nd. At 11 o'clock last night, as Mr. Van Wyck, member of Congress from Orange County, New York, was returning alone from the rooms of Honorable Preston King on Capitol Hill, he was assaulted by 3 assassins whose evident purpose was to take his life. Mr. Van Wyck was approached from behind by one of the villains who, when just alongside, made a desperate lunge at his breast with a knife. The knife penetrated Mr. Van Wyck's overcoat, undercoat, and also passed through a triple folded copy of the Globe, it's a newspaper, and nearly through a pocket memorandum book. It was a most deadly blow, and but for a copy of the Globe and the memorandum book would have been fatal. Mr. Van Wyck immediately turned and struck his assailant down. At the same moment, a second assailant came up and struck at Mr. Van Wyck with a knife, a blow from which he received in his left hand while warding it off. And at the same time, Mr. Van Wyck knocked down his second assailant with his right hand. Immediately thereafter, Mr. Van Wyck had succeeded in getting his pistol out, who fired at his first assailant, who fell. But Mr. Van Wyck at this moment was himself knocked down by a violent blow from the third assassin, which stunned him for a time. The rascals then made off with their probably wounded companion. After the assassins had retreated, Mr. Van W. recovered his consciousness and managed to return to his rooms at the National Hotel. It is hoped that Mr. Van W. is not seriously, although he is obliged to keep to his bed. Van Wyck, in fact, was not seriously injured. He survived the attack, was reelected in 1861 for a second 2-year term in Congress, during which he served while at the same time becoming colonel and commander of the 56th New York Infantry, which was part of the 10th Legion, organized as a combined force of infantry, cavalry, and artillery. During the Peninsula Campaign in 1862, he suffered a knee wound in action at the Battle of Fair Oaks and went on to command on the brigade and district level in South Carolina, participating in the 1863 siege of Charleston and elsewhere. He mustered out of the Army in 1866 as a brigadier general and returned to politics in his earlier role as a New York congressman and later in his adopted state of Nebraska as a United States senator. He died in 1895 after suffering a stroke. One of his mementos was a presentation sword given to him during the war while he was in South Carolina. It was inscribed, Colonel Van Wyck, our comrade in the hour of danger, our friend always. The privates and non-commissioned officers of the 10th Legion present this token of their regard. Though largely forgotten today, Van Wyck is still remembered here and now. A search of his name turns up numerous references to the words he spoke on March 7th, 1860, on the floor of the U.S. House, that anti-slavery speech that stirred up the passions of the Democratic representatives, including Mississippi and Georgia. That speech is entitled True Democracy, History Vindicated. So there you have the story of Charles Van Wyck, member of Congress, veteran, soldier with the 56th New York Infantry, and a brigadier general. Thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.